In 1848, the Austrian Empire was on the verge of disintegration. Revolt had broken out in Vienna, Hungary had effectively seceded, the statesman that had dominated the empire for the last 40 years, Clemens von Metternich, had fled into exile. In Italy, the Piedmontese king had declared a war for Italian liberation and invaded the Austrian provinces of Lombardy Venetia. The imperial family, surrounding the invalid Ferdinand I, had twice been chased out of Vienna and now awaited their fate in Olmütz. To most of Europe, it seemed as if the Habsburg monarchy was about to collapse. In Frankfurt, the recently created parliament eagerly eyed the Austrian lands for incorporation into a German state led by the Prussian king. The man that would be tasked with reviving this ancient and crumbling monarchy was a tall, slender, and prematurely aged aristocrat of 48 years. Having spent most of his life as a debauched Regency-era dandy in England, there was little to suggest that the new minister-president would be any more successful than his 6 predecessors that year. Yet Prince Felix Schwarzenberg would, in a matter of months, restore the Austrian Empire to a status not known since Leopold II. His first move was to secure the throne itself. The current Austrian emperor was the well-meaning but disabled Ferdinand I, of little use to anyone as monarch. More pressingly, as a crowned king of Hungary, Ferdinand had taken solemn coronation oaths to defend the special privileges of that kingdom, and in 1848 had signed the April Laws, effectively creating it an independent country, in all but name. Whilst the monarch who had made such promises wore the crown, Schwarzenberg was severely restricted in what force he could use to crush the rebellions, so, on the 2nd of December 1848, Ferdinand was persuaded to abdicate in favour of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph. He had been trained to rule from birth by his mother Archduchess Sophie. He was proficient in Hungarian, Italian, Czech, Polish, Latin, French and ancient Greek, already had ample military experience and a propensity for hard work. With a young and dutiful monarch now on the throne who had sworn no oaths, Schwarzenberg could now turn his attention to governing. He had 3 main tasks upon taking office in 1848. The first was to establish Franz Joseph's authority in what remained of his empire, the second, to regain what had been lost, namely Hungary and the Italian provinces, and finally to re-establish Austrian supremacy in Germany, thwarting the rival ambitions of Prussia. Schwarzenberg started with the remaining empire. He set about constructing a strong cabinet around him, caring nothing for nobility or birth status. Despite being from one of Austria's most illustrious families, Schwarzenberg despised his own class for having brought the empire to disaster. His new Austria would be unrecognisable from Metternich's. Old traditions and constitutional settlements were swept aside. In place for the first time was a single centralised government in Vienna, with no internal barriers on trade, whose bureaucrats' reach was to extend to every corner of Franz Joseph's realm. Even Joseph II could hardly have envisaged something so radical. Schwarzenberg's ultimate aim was for an efficient absolute monarchy, but a constitution had been promised by Emperor Ferdinand in 1848, and thus one had to be promulgated, if only to quieten liberal discontent in the short term. A constituent assembly, recently removed to Kremsmir, had been appointed for such a task before Schwarzenberg had taken office. Here, representatives from throughout the empire attempted to work out a liberal constitution. They were eventually able to thrash one out, but it had serious flaws. For example, Article 1 declared all political rights emanate from the people. No Habsburg monarch could have accepted such a statement. The Assembly planned to vote through the constitution nonetheless on the 15th of March 1849. On the 7th, Schwarzenberg sent in the troops and dissolved it, arresting various deputies. The fact this was done in Franz Joseph's name was to add a black mark to the new monarch's record. Earlier politicians like Metternich would never have exposed their sovereign's prestige in this way. Nothing could have better contrasted Metternich's conservatism with Schwarzenberg's ruthlessness. With the farce in Kremsmir dissolved, he promulgated his own constitution, largely drawn up by Minister of the Interior Count Stadion. This formalised his centralisation efforts, turning the empire into one vast customs union. It set up 2 elected chambers as a parliament, though the constitution also gave the emperor absolute legislative power through provisional decrees, only to be ratified when parliament was convened, which would of course be at some arbitrary date far in the future. De jure, Schwarzenberg had his centralised state. De facto, he had his absolute monarchy. In November 1848, General Windisch-Gratz had retaken Vienna for the dynasty. With the capital secure, the Austrian fight back could begin. In Italy, an uneasy armistice had held since the 83-year-old General Radetzky defeated the Piedmontese at Custoza in July 1848. By 1849, the Piedmontese king Charles Albert was watching with increasing dismay as protracted mediation efforts from the British and French did little more than buy Austria time to prepare for the next stage of the war. On the 12th, he restarted the conflict. On the 22nd, Radetzky met the Piedmontese army at the Battle of Novara and defeated it. Charles Albert abdicated. In August, Piedmont offered peace, and Lombardy-Venetia was fully returned to Austrian control. The victory in Italy was undoubtedly decisive and reclaimed the richest provinces of the empire for the Habsburgs, but the wisdom of waging such a campaign is somewhat questionable. The Italians were the only people in the empire that could never be fully reconciled to any form of Habsburg rule. Coming to some sort of accommodation with Charles Albert would have allowed Austria to free up the men needed to crush the Hungarian Revolution without outside interference, and the diplomatic complications that came with it. For now though, the question was settled. Schwarzenberg's other pressing task was to deal with the situation in Hungary. Having revoked the April laws, the kingdom had now fully broken with the Habsburgs, deposing them on the 14th of April 1849. Windischgratz had seized Budapest in January 1849, but in April he had been forced back by Hungarian troops. For this failure, the man who had largely saved Franz Joseph's throne was ignominiously sacked. For Schwarzenberg, however, it could hardly have been planned better. Windischgratz was one of the last old conservatives with any real influence. Now he was out of the way, the path was open for Schwarzenberg to govern as radically as he saw fit. But first, Hungary had to be crushed. Yet the new commander, von Velden, immediately declared he needed more men. There was only two places they could be found. One option was to settle with Charles Albert in Italy and free up Radetzky's army. This was not even considered. That left only one choice, an appeal to Russia. Since the Napoleonic Wars, Austria, Russia and Prussia had been bound by an agreement known as the Holy Alliance. The aim had always been to contain revolutionary movements on the continent and preserve monarchical authority. But few were so naive as to think a rival state would throw away its own men's lives for the sake of so vague a concept. There would always be a bill to pay, and for this reason Schwarzenberg had previously argued against any Russian involvement. Yet, if he wanted Hungary defeated and Italy held, there was no alternative. Nicholas I, the gendarme of Europe, didn't need asking twice. 200,000 Russians were soon marching through the Carpathians, and by August 1849 it was all over for the Hungarians. Almost immediately the problems became apparent. Nicholas, greatest of all European despots, suddenly developed into the model of an enlightened liberal and appealed for clemency for the Hungarian rebels. Schwarzenberg's response was, yes, a good idea, but first we shall have a little hanging. He was not going to be told how to conduct his business by anybody. General Haynau, a brilliant military commander but a complete psychopath, was unleashed upon the population and had 4,600 Hungarians arrested, 1,500 imprisoned, whilst 120 were executed. Nonetheless, Hungary was now crushed. Government was left to Alexander von Bach, supported by a stream of German bureaucrats that set out to run the kingdom efficiently. With the core empire secure, Schwarzenberg could now turn to his third and final task, the humbling of Prussia. The Frankfurt Parliament, which I won't go into detail about here, had been trying since the outbreak of the 1848 revolutions to unite the divided states of the German Confederation into a liberal constitutional monarchy. The Habsburgs were the traditional leaders of the German states, but with Vienna now establishing itself as the capital of reaction, the Parliament chose to offer the imperial crown of this new country to the Prussian King Frederick William IV. But Frederick William, whilst wishing to expand Prussia's influence, was still at heart a romantic and saw the Austrian Emperor as his liege lord. He thus rejected an imperial crown given to him by election rather than divine right. But Frederick William nonetheless did still hope for some kind of Prussian-led union. This came to fruition in the League of Three Kings with Saxony and Hanover, followed by the Erfurt Union in 1850. The general premise was for a so-called inner union under Prussian leadership within the German Confederation. Schwarzenberg was outraged and claimed it was illegal under the terms of the Confederation. His real problem was, of course, that it extended Prussia's influence at Austria's expense. Thus, with the backing of Russia, he pressured the 4 other German kingdoms, Hanover, Saxony, Bavaria and Württemberg, to abandon the scheme and instead join Austria's proposal, which was to completely re-establish the German Confederation, as it had been before 1848, naturally under Habsburg leadership. By September 1849 he had succeeded in recreating the Confederal Assembly in Frankfurt. He was now ready for a final showdown with Prussia. Schwarzenberg chose to make his stand on the issue of Confederal armed intervention on behalf of the reactionary elector of Hessen-Kassel, having trouble with subjects injured in their constitutional rights. Schwarzenberg, with all the German states that mattered and Russia on his side, demanded Prussian troops evacuate the north of Hessen. In doing so, he effectively trapped Prussia between an ignominious climb down and recognising the German Confederation as a reality once more, or a war she was in no position to fight. In the punctuation of Olmütz on the 29th of November 1850, Prussia chose to back down and subsequently agreed to the re-establishment of the German Confederation, effectively unchanged from before 1848. It was an almost dizzying triumph that restored Austrian prestige completely. Those that had pitied the state of the Habsburg monarchy now feared it. In just 2 years, Schwarzenberg had taken an empire on the verge of disintegration and made it once more a great power. Yet, for all the undoubted greatness of these triumphs, each was of an only superficial nature. Piedmont had been defeated but not crushed, whilst Italians were no more reconciled to the Habsburgs than they had been before 1848. The Hungarian question, whilst for now solved at the end of a bayonet, only needed an opportunity to rear its head once more. Prussia, though humiliated, had not been permanently neutered, as Schwarzenberg himself well knew. War would perhaps have been better, he said after Olmütz, and would have bought peace lasting 50 years. Despite these problems, his skill as a statesman is not in doubt. Had he survived another 20 years, it is hard to see that Austria would have met the same fate that befell her in reality. Yet in 1852, Schwarzenberg died suddenly from a stroke. Within just 14 years of his death, his work was to be undone. Franz Joseph was not an incompetent in foreign affairs, but he was no match for the twin geniuses of Cavour and Bismarck, spectacularly displayed in 1866, when he failed to decide between an Italian or a German policy. In the end, he lost both. With it, Magyar anger revived, and Franz Joseph was forced to grant an autonomy not too dissimilar from the April laws Schwarzenberg had had him revoke. Schwarzenberg's triumph was equal to that of any of the other great statesmen in the 19th century, his legacy worthy only of the worst.